Let me introduce Brian Benz. He is a cloud advocate at Microsoft. Yeah, he has a demo, I think.
I do.
Hello.
How are you today?
Yeah, I'm
How's
fine.
it going?
How are you? Yeah, it's
Good,
okay.
thanks. Good, thanks. I'm connected in here today from Las Vegas. It's early morning over
Oh,
here, so yeah,
that's great.
it's good to see you and good to see everyone out there. But yeah, we got. I'm going to talk about DevOps for Java shops today. I've got a lot to cover in 30 minutes, so I guess we should get started.
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks for joining. My name is Brian Benz. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I'm going to take you through a few options that you have for working with DevOps with Java. And just got a few slides here, and then we're going to get right into a demo. And then after the demo, if I have time, I'm going to cover a few other things, some of our container offerings. But the main thing is here, I want to show you some code and some cool ways to do things. All right, so see, oh, we got the cool animation going. Look at that. So what I'm going to talk about today is what is DevOps, people, process, and products, keep your investments, and DevOps in action. So we'll just dive right into it. We only got 30 minutes. So the main thing I want to talk about, I'm assuming that everyone's heard of DevOps by now, and everybody is familiar with how DevOps helps accelerate delivery of software to the production environment that you're looking for. But I do want to share with you this quote. I think it's a great quote that sums up DevOps very well. DevOps is a union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to end users. So my colleague at Microsoft, Donovan Brown, put that together. And it's just a nice way to summarize how DevOps works. You've got people, you've got processes you have to work with, and you've got products. If some of those things are not supporting your DevOps environment, you're going to have trouble. So I do want to let's just dive right into the actual products. So people, of course, you've got developers who well, you've got project managers and other people who are stakeholders who are actually wanting to deliver the software. You've got people who want to do the development and testing. You've got your release pipelines that you need to manage. And then, of course, you've got monitoring and learn. So this is a great, software development lifecycle. It's a typical setup that you need to plan and track, develop and test, release, and then monitor and learn. Figure out if the actual product that you delivered actually did what it's supposed to do. People, process, and products is very important here. You've got to be able to manage the process all the way through, and each person in that process needs to know what their role is and make sure that everyone is working together in sync. You also have products, and there's a lot of products out there that you might already be working with. In the Java world, you're often working with many of these products here. There's the GitHub, of course, Eclipse, Jenkins, Chef, Puppet, other tools that you might be using already. And the good news is you can keep those investments. You don't necessarily have to give up or learn new things or reinvest things that already work. If something already works, you don't have to throw it away and start over. When you're working with DevOps, on Azure specifically, we have ways of making all of these things work together with your DevOps lifecycle. So let's just give you one example of that, which is Jenkins. So Jenkins, we actually work a lot with Jenkins. We actually provide some funding up until recently for delivering Jenkins on Azure. So Jenkins was built and tested and delivered on Azure. And out of that came a partnership where we actually built things like this. We have a reference architecture that you can use to build Jenkins on virtual machines. If you prefer containers, if you're in the container world, we actually have a reference architecture for containers as well. and we have a CI/CD pipeline all set up. The cool thing about this, if you're working with Azure and you click on that link down at the bottom, AKMS Jenkins containers, or the previous one, which is Jenkins VMs, the ref architecture there, there is actually an automated process that will deploy this entire infrastructure for you on Azure, including Jenkins and everything you need to deploy to Azure Kubernetes Service, which is our managed Kubernetes, which I will talk about later. So that's kind of cool. Another aspect of that partnership is our Jenkins plugins. So we have a ton of Jenkins plugins that Microsoft actually supports. They've developed and supported them, and that actually helps with that whole process. If you want to integrate your Jenkins, let's say you're doing builds and testing in Jenkins, which most people are. But then when you do deployment, you probably do FTP or some kind of secure copy or something that doesn't really manage the security behind the deployment itself. In this case, you can set up and use our plugins to integrate with a couple of tools we have, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, and some other things to actually manage those deployments. So when I talk to people in Jenkins, in the Java world, they're mostly using Jenkins for build and test, but then they have sort of another ad hoc process for deployment. In this case, if you're using Azure or actually any other cloud, you could actually deploy in a managed way using our Jenkins plugins. And I'll explain, I'm going to give you a demo of that in a little bit as well. So, all right, so a couple things I want to talk about today is Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. So taking what you already have and what you've already built, you can do some cool things with Azure DevOps as well. Azure DevOps has Azure boards, which are Kanban boards. They're very sophisticated. We use them internally at Microsoft to do pretty much everything these days in terms of organizing our process. And the cool thing about Kanban boards is you can set up tasks, you can delegate tasks, you can manage the status of tasks, and you can follow a task all the way through the software development lifecycle. We also have Azure repos for storing code. And of course, we have GitHub as well. But today I'm actually going to focus on Azure pipelines. And Azure pipelines is what you can use to deploy to any cloud, including our competitors, AWS, Google Cloud, and others. There's deployment approvals, including automated options and things like that. And there's native support for containers and Kubernetes. We also have Azure Artifacts as well, and Azure Test Plan. So Azure Artifacts is a way to manage, in the Jenkins, in the Java world, to manage your Maven builds and artifacts. You can also manage any other artifact-based system for builds like Node, NPM, and others as well. And we have Azure Test Plans for doing load testing and website testing too. On the other hand, we have GitHub. So GitHub has GitHub Actions. A lot of you have probably heard about GitHub Actions. I'm going to show you an example of one in a little bit. We also have GitHub Extensions, which people haven't really, I find they haven't heard about it as much as Actions. And I'll explain what those are when I go through our demo. And we also, we integrate with Azure and other clouds, of course. We have integration with popular IDEs. In my case, I always use Visual Studio Code, and it integrates with GitHub really, really well. And these days, people might not keep up with the news. There are free private repos for individuals and teams to a certain level on GitHub. So check that out. Most people assume that you can only have public repos that are free on GitHub, but actually there's private repos now with certain limits are free as well. All right, so we advertised a demo. Let's deliver a demo. As I said, I'm going to go through this demo, and then if I have time, I'm going to show a few other slides, and then we'll wrap up. I understand I have just about 20 minutes left, so let's go with this. Okay, so what I'm going to show you today is basically what I showed you in the slides. This is my Azure portal. So if I go to portal.azure.com and I have a subscription, I can drop down and I can see a whole bunch of different pages that I have inside my portal. In this case, I organize my work based on presentations a lot of the time. So I have one of these portals for each presentation. Over here in the first square, this is my resource group. So I have an application that is running on the cloud, and it's just a really basic Spring Boot application, but it's managed by this thing called by application configuration, which manages feature flags for me. I'll show what that is in a minute. And then over here, I have a bunch of links that help me find things when I'm working on stuff for demos, because when I'm working on stuff for demos, I have to be able to find things quickly. So I have links over here to all the things we're working on. In here, I have what's called a resource group. And a resource group is a way of grouping all your assets, your resources together in the cloud. In this case, I have a production web app. I have a staging web app. I have a GitHub web app, because I'm doing both Azure DevOps and GitHub. And then I have this thing called a deployment slot, and I'll explain what that is in a bit. And then I have an app service plan, which manages all of these, and I can scale it up and scale it down whenever I want to. Over here, I have my application configuration, which is a resource manager. It's in a different resource group, and that's organized over here so that I can manage multiple applications with one application configuration manager. So let me show you the application real quick. It's a pretty boring application. There it is. It's just a Spring Boot application. And if you want to know about feature management with Spring Cloud Azure, there it is. It's on something we call App Service, which is our SaaS platform for running Java and other code platforms as well. Now, one of the cool things about this is I can control what users see in this application using feature flags. So commonly when you're doing Azure DevOps, you want to do things like A/B testing, okay? Now, how do you actually do A/B testing? There's a couple of different ways. You can deploy to different servers and then use a load balancer to send people to one server to another, but it's hard to actually track their behavior when you do that. So Feature Manager is really cool because you can track who sees a new feature and who sees the old version of the website and see what their behavior is and see if the actual tool that you're using, the actual software that you're delivering, delivers what you actually promised in the phases. You remember I showed you that software development lifecycle? Well, you can actually plan something, you can develop and test it, you can deploy it, but did that actually do the job that you expected it to? Did it have the effect that you expected to have? One cool way to be able to do that is A/B testing. Some people see one version of the site, some people see another, and you track the behavior of both. So let's get into the feature manager here. If I go into my feature manager, and I'll explain what this is, I've got a couple of things configured here. I've got some different feature flags that I've got set up. And all I need to do, I go into my feature manager, and I can turn on this one called beta. And when I turn on the one called beta up on the right, it says feature flag named beta was updated successfully. So it happens pretty much instantly. Let's go back to our page now. And this will take a few refreshes, but you'll see a new version of the page. There we go. So the idea here is I've just turned on this flag. I haven't changed the application at all, but inside the code, there is a reference back to that feature manager. And that feature manager can manage an unlimited amount of applications. So I can have one feature manager controlling a whole bunch of different applications in my infrastructure. In this case, it just shows a picture of our mascot bit. If you notice up here, there's a little menu option for beta as well. So I can turn that on and off using the feature manager. I can also do something like set up a 50-50, which is basically you set up some JSON code and you set up a percentage, and that percentage says 50% of the users will see the new version of this site, 50% of the users will see the old version of the site. So that's basically how you control the feature manager. Now, how do you actually get the code into production with the feature manager enabled? so that you can turn that on and off. That's the next thing we're going to talk about. Excuse me, losing my voice. So to do that, we go back to our portal here, and I've got a production, a staging, and a GitHub. We just looked at the GitHub app service, but I've also got a Azure DevOps project. So Azure DevOps, as mentioned before, it's got boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, artifacts, compliance. So the first thing I do, I can deploy this using Azure DevOps. If I do that, I go into my pipelines, and what I've got actually this set up so that each time I change something in my application, so let's go out to GitHub. Anytime I change anything in this application, it will automatically get connected to my Azure DevOps project. And inside the Azure DevOps project, it triggers a build and a release. So the build is called pipeline. If I go in here and I go into the last successful pipeline build and I say edit, I need to authorize this. One of the nice things about this, if you're using Azure DevOps, security is built in because you're inside of Azure, right? So if you have an Azure account, you've authenticated with that Azure account, you can control who has access to this easily. If someone joins the team, leaves the team, you turn on and off their access, and everything is done inside of the application. So that's what I was talking about before. You can do your build and your release with Jenkins, and then you can use a plugin with Jenkins to actually send your code to Azure DevOps. And you can optionally build or just take an artifact that's already been built in Jenkins and put it into our deployments. In this case, we're doing a build because I want to show you how builds work. This one is a Maven package. It's just a Java Spring application. And let's see, it uses something called a managed host. So if I go back here and I show you our hosted agents, I'll show you this. So Microsoft hosted agents are actually where the build takes place. And we have Windows Server 2016, Ubuntu, and we actually have Mac OS X as well. And if I go into Ubuntu here, you can see all the software that we have built into these hosted agents you can use right off the bat. There's different versions of Java, there's Python, there's Android development environments, tons of stuff in here already built in. So, and if you don't have, if you need something that's not in here, you can actually get that, add it to your process when you're building things. In this case, I use the VM image name Ubuntu 1804. And I'd say, go get me a virtual machine with Ubuntu on it and run this build. And in this case, we're going to do a Maven package and publish artifacts. We use Maven 3. There's a pom.xml that tells Maven what to do. Then we copy the files into a artifact directory. And that artifact directory then notifies the release that we have a new version that needs to be deployed. And that moves it onto the release process, which I'll show you in a second. You don't have to know a lot about, this is a YAML file. The YAML, there's all kinds of pre-configured YAML here that you can use if you want to just grab something. And this works with AWS, it works with Google as well, not just Azure. But for example, if you want to just add a GitHub release in here, let's see here. There we go. Jenkins download. So there's a Jenkins download artifact. So anytime an artifact gets dropped into Jenkins, it will actually trigger a build over here as well. And you link that together through one of those Jenkins plugins that I talked about earlier. You can also queue a job on a Jenkins server. So you can actually control Jenkins from Azure DevOps as well. And there's a whole bunch of other tools in here. There's Maven. What I used is the Maven build test as a base, and then I coded some custom YAML as well just to build this out. So what happens next is, actually, let me back up a little bit. So I showed you the GitHub repo. Anytime there's a change in that GitHub repo, there's a link between the GitHub repo and Azure DevOps using a GitHub extension. Now, I mentioned those before. People are more familiar with GitHub Actions these days, which are hosted agents that run on GitHub. GitHub extensions are tools that are built by third parties. In this case, Microsoft built a tool that links GitHub and Azure DevOps together. So anytime there's a change that is actually pushed to my GitHub repo, it will automatically trigger this build in Azure DevOps. And when there's a successful build, then we move on to releases. In this case, if I edit the release pipeline, here's what it looks like. So I mentioned before, the last thing that build does is drop an artifact. Here's the drop. You can pick up the drop. You can set a continuous deployment trigger, which actually activates this anytime there's a successful build. So it will deploy. It goes out to staging, which is our staging server. And if we look at that, so our staging server is a web app on Linux called Java Shop Staging. And this is the startup command it uses for actually running that. You can do a jar or a war. These are pre-built tasks that you can use. I've just used the pre-built jar task. Then we have a deployment to something called Canary. So Canary is where our A/B testing comes in. In Azure Web Apps, you can deploy to the main production web app, or there's these things called deployment slots. And the deployment slots allow you to control what is actually built. And you can actually test things in production. So it sounds a little scary, but you're not in production. You're using the production server or a replica of it to actually test your application before it goes out to production. In this case, you deploy to a deployment slot. The users still see the full website the way it used to be, but you have a new version of this website sitting there in a slice, waiting to be deployed out to production. And you can use that for A/B testing as well. So I showed you in the feature flag, you can set up A/B testing. Here you can set up A/B testing too. So you can actually set a deployment slot percentage to 50-50. Half the people will see the production version of the website, and half the people will see the version that's sitting on the deployment slot on the production website. And finally, it goes to production. Now, you don't always want, every time you do a change in GitHub, it triggers a build and then triggers this release. You don't always want that to go straight into production, right? So there's a couple of things you can do to prevent that. In this case, you can have a post-deployment condition. In this case, I approve any post-deployment conditions, meaning we're done with Canary, we've tested it, and it's ready to go to production. But the production people, the people who actually manage production, might have something else to say about that. They might not exactly want it to be deployed at whenever the development team decides. They might want to deploy it at midnight on Saturdays or something like that, because they're not developers and they don't know what happens when you deploy at midnight on Saturdays, right? Anyway, the pre-deployment approvals can be set to deploy at a certain specific time as well. So the development team, the test team can say, okay, we're done with this stage. And then the production team has to approve it as well. And there are automated triggers you can use for both of these. I use the simplest version of the approvals, which is just managing by name. It will be sent to me. I have to approve it personally. But you can actually do automatic triggers as well. Go out and check a third-party tool that checks to make sure that the software is compliant with whatever requirements you have in your data governance and governance situation. So that, in a nutshell, is Azure DevOps. So you've got builds, which you saw controlled by YAML, and then you've got your releases here as well. And by the way, you can control this with YAML as well. I just like to show this because it's a nice visual version, and you can get really complicated with these too. You can have different branches depending on conditions. You can deploy to multiple locations. Let's say you have a mobile app and a production app. You can do that all in one place, and you can get very, very complicated with multi-stage, multi-level deployments here. Now, the other thing I mentioned was GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions, let's just go straight into here. Let's go to this one. Yeah. So this is the GitHub repo for GitHub Actions as well. And the way that you control actions, you can do the same thing I described here. Anytime there's a push to this repo, it will trigger an action. And that action will actually deploy to an Azure web app as well. And that build and deploy job works similar to what we had in Azure DevOps with a few less features. You don't have that nice multi-level, multi-stage process. You don't have the approvals built in and things like that. But if we go into the code here, you can actually see that this is actually controlled. If you go to the GitHub workflows, this is controlled by a YAML file as well. And it's very similar to what I showed you in Azure DevOps, where you have a preset YAML file, and it uses the latest version of Ubuntu. It checks out the code for you, so it actually checks out a version so people can continue to work on it. It runs, in this case, it runs with Java version 11. It does a Maven clean install. It uses the pom.xml to actually deploy out to the web app with a target jar. So very similar. In this case, it deploys out, and as I mentioned, you can actually look at the log files. And by the way, you can look at the log files in Azure DevOps too. I just didn't have time to drill into that. But you can see at different stages what actually happens. So let's set up the Java version, and then deploy the Azure web app, and you can tell in the steps here if something's gone wrong. And then at the end, you get the final result. So there we go. That's the demo that I wanted to show you today using Azure DevOps and Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. What about containers? We only have 3 minutes left, but I did want to tell you, if you're using something like testcontainers.org, which is a great JUnit built-in container system, we have several things you can use. We have a private registry, an Azure Container Registry, and in there you can do an ACR build, which is just like Docker build, but it actually goes out to our container registry, runs a build on that registry, and if everything's okay, it adds an instance into the registry for you that you can deploy. You can deploy it out to Azure Container Instances, which is kind of a cool thing. We have a Kubernetes cluster that you can borrow a node from. That's basically what this is. Azure Container Instances, and you can put more than one container in an instance. So if you're using something like tracing with your primary application, it's a great way to go and test if this is going to run on Kubernetes or not. So Azure Container Instances, you use something in the Azure CLI to just deploy it. I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to skip over that. And you can deploy out to AKS if you want to do a fully managed, fully controlled Kubernetes environment. You can set up your own Kubernetes on VMs, but we also have a managed Kubernetes that you can use too. All right, so wrapping up the last couple of minutes, I went through the container stuff really quickly, but there's some links at the end here where you can see more details. So what is DevOps? I talked about people, process, and products. You can keep your investments. DevOps in action. Also, there's some docs here, and this is where I wanted to refer you. There's a lot more information here than's covered in a 30-minute session, but you can find more info at these, and I'll share the slides later and the links. And that's it. My name is Brian Benz. This is DevOps for Java Shops. Hopefully you found it useful. And please follow me on Twitter at bbenz. If you have any questions, you can ask me over there as well. And just leave you with there's a whole DevOps for Java Shops repo here I have, which covers all of this in detail, and you can set up the demo that I showed you here. And I think that's my time. So I just want to say thanks for joining. Do follow me over at, check out my DevOps for Java Shops workshop, and follow me on Twitter at bbenz. So thanks.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for a really great demo. We'll have to try all of this stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful for our guys, probably regarding Java development and also Azure stuff as well. And
awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
I was going to say, I hope the next time we can do this in person. Yeah, that'll be awesome.
Sure. It should be really great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much. It was great being here today.